Muy buenos días. Damos inicio a la tercera y última sesión de la Cátedra Currie 2021, Capitalismo de accionistas para el siglo XXI, organizada por el Centro de Investigaciones para el Desarrollo CID de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Hoy, nuestro invitado internacional a la cátedra, Karthik Ramanna, profesor de la Escuela de Gobierno Blavatnik de la Universidad de Oxford, nos hablará sobre gestión empresarial en una época de indignación. Hoy desarrollaremos la siguiente agenda. Presentación del invitado por parte del moderador de la conferencia, profesor Jorge Iván Bula, director del Centro de Investigaciones para el Desarrollo CID de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Conferencia, tercera sesión, Gestión empresarial en una época de indignación, por el invitado internacional, profesor Karthik Ramanna. Comentarios por parte del profesor Mauricio Gómez de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Tendremos una sesión de preguntas por parte de los participantes y hoy tendremos al final al profesor Jorge Iván Bula cerrando nuestra cátedra 2021. Desde ya le hacemos la invitación especial para la cátedra Currie 2022. Un abrazo para todos y feliz tarde.
Sorry, do I launch right in? I couldn't follow the introduction. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. And I don't know whether some of your colleagues are joining me on the video feed. But I'm delighted to be here, and absolutely a pleasure to do this third and final session on shareholder capitalism for the 21st century. And what I thought I would do, since it's been about a week since we last congregated, to just share with you some recap of where we were for the previous two sessions. And in the first session last week, we did cover some ideas around why there is a legitimacy challenge to shareholder capitalism in this day and age. In the context of that, I shared with you a number of sort of graphical charts that were there really to give you a sense of some of the underlying hypotheses that are driving this this particular concern or legitimacy challenge around shareholder capitalism. The first is, of course, the idea that people are feeling especially unhopeful about the future, largely because of rising morbidity, because of declining economic opportunity, stagnating wages, and the like. The second is a hypothesis around the fact that people feel like these outcomes, like rising morbidity and stagnating inequality, are not exogenous, but in fact due to certain policy choices we've made. And these policy choices are effectively a representation of structural capture of the rules of the game by elites. And the third hypothesis is one that emanates from these first two, that really focuses on the issue of increasing ideological extremism across the political spectrum, and a decreasing consensus in the idea that that market capitalism and liberal democracy are in fact, the stable states of society in the long run. So in that first session, we covered these hypotheses and some data around them. In the second session, what we did was explore some alternatives to shareholder capitalism. And in the context of those alternatives, I laid out, that a number of people have advocated things like production subsidies through greater economic nationalism, things like consumption subsidies like the universal basic income, and also an increased production of public goods, of private goods in public spheres. So the increased internalization of production into sort of the public sector. But I noted that these various policy choices are still not as mainstream as one particular policy choice, which is gaining lots of currency, which is stakeholder capitalism. And so I spent a lot of time on the session last Wednesday addressing why stakeholder capitalism is a particularly dangerous idea. And I covered basically three reasons. One, because there's actually very little evidence that companies will do the right thing when there isn't a win-win involved. When there is a win-win involved, then of course, it's a matter that we will in fact consider today. But when there's no win-win involved and when nobody's looking, there's very little evidence that companies will do the right thing. The second is the idea that putting companies in charge of these sort of reallocation decisions actually makes them very powerful on topics that really we don't want companies to have a lot of power on. Things like abortion rights or gun control and matters like that. Issues that we see as purely political rather than issues that companies need to be in control of. And the third is the notion of separation of powers, the idea that there is a distinct role for business in society, but separately there are important roles for government and civil society organizations like media and like religion and like sports and universities and so forth. And that the solution to the decline of these civil society and public institutions is not necessarily to put business in charge, because that can, of course, result in a dangerous co-location of powers rather than separation of powers across sectors. So that was really the focus of the last few hours we've spent together in the context of the 19th and 20th of October. And if I've, in fact, convinced you, at least in some small measure, that there is, in fact, a legitimacy challenge to capitalism, but that stakeholder capitalism is not the solution, then I suppose it's incumbent on me to provide you some sort of solution. I can't say there's a problem, and by the way, the solution that everybody is proposing is the wrong solution. That would be irresponsible. So in this third and final session, what I will do is offer you a sense of how shareholder capitalism, in particular, can respond to these legitimacy challenges that we've talked about that are indeed very real. So what does shareholder capitalism for this age of outrage look like? And what can corporate managers do to address this legitimacy challenge to capitalism that we've been talking about? And what I've done for the purposes of a corporate audience is put this down as 7 simple rules. Now, I appreciate that this isn't a corporate audience. This is an academic audience and plus students in economics departments. But of course, many of these students will go on to become executives in corporations and hopefully leaders of corporations. And so what I will do is spend time framing the solutions from the perspective of managerial prescriptions or managerial guidance. But I'm happy to, especially in the Q&A part of this, take some questions on the conceptual ideas that motivate some of these sort of prescriptions that I will offer today. So whereas the first session was largely descriptive in nature, in that I presented a lot of data, and in the second session, it was largely about logical arguments. In this third session, it's largely normative in nature because I'm going to offer some prescriptions on how business can respond within the context of profit seeking. As I said earlier, the legitimacy crisis to shareholder capitalism is in fact very real, and it would be irresponsible for businesses to sit back and really do nothing in the context of that legitimacy crisis. Effectively sit back and watch the world burn. Certainly that is not a responsible thing to do. But I think it's responsible to recognize that in the context of any business response, there needs to be win-wins. That is to say, we cannot, on a structural level, expect business to do the right thing if business cannot also make money in the process. As long as business is making money in the process, we can align incentives and say they will do the right thing. But if business has no money to make in the process, that's going to be really hard. Now, dynamic, the idea of business making money through through the navigation of these challenges is basically an example of what economists would call a dynamic long-run optimization problem. And what they mean by that is that this is not a static problem where you can, in one period, let's call the period t equals 1, figure out the entire profit maximization strategy of the firm for the rest of all time and say, this is the only way in which we will make money for the rest of all time. That doesn't work even in the context of a normal competitive market, because of course new technologies will emerge, new competitors will emerge, new marketing methods will emerge, and businesses have to respond on an ongoing basis. And therefore, the profit maximization strategy for any company is not a static strategy over time. In fact, it's dynamic. So the strategy adopted in t equals 1 will be a different one from t equals 2, will be a different one from t equals 3, etc. And so what I'm saying is that companies cannot sit back and watch the world burn, but at the same time, what we have to expect is that companies will have limited actions, limited responses in the context of solving this problem on a time by time or period by period basis in incremental steps that work with or that align with their profit making activities. And so if you look at the first two of these rules, don't ignore the problem, but don't become an activist either. That's really just the prescriptive format of what I've just said in the context of economic language. So in fact, I'll give you an example of that. And the example I use of that is one of PepsiCo under Indira Nooyi. So Indira Nooyi served as CEO of Pepsi for about a long and glorious decade. But her reign as CEO of Pepsi was actually a fairly checkered one. Now, in retrospect, we look back at that reign as one of great success, and Indira Nooyi is often regarded as a highly successful CEO of a large Fortune 500 consumer-facing business in the context of an age of outrage. But it wasn't always smooth sailing for her. And in fact, when she became CEO of PepsiCo, my own sense is that she had deep existential questions about the legitimacy of her own product, because Pepsi, at the end of the day, is a junk food company. I mean, Pepsi makes its money selling carbonated beverages and potato chips, neither of which have any kind of nutritional value. Those are the high profit margin businesses in Pepsi. And imagine if you are the CEO of a company in the middle of a nutrition sort of an obesity epidemic in across the world, and in circumstances where people are concerned about the nutrition quality of your product, and you're selling carbonated beverages and potato chips. What do you do? Well, as a responsible CEO, you might say, well, I'm going to reimagine the purpose of my company to become a health food company. And so in the first inning of Indira Nooyi's reign as the CEO of Pepsi, she in fact engaged in a massive process of business transformation where she said Pepsi was going to become a health food company. Now, of course, we all know that health foods don't sell as well and as profitably as junk foods. So when Indira Nooyi effected this transformation, the impact on the bottom line of Pepsi was very much felt. And she came within the skin of her teeth of losing her job within a few years of starting the job. I think it was 2 or 3 years into the process. There were massive shareholder revolts against her activism. And she just about survived effectively an impeachment process from activist shareholders when she realized she had to recalibrate her strategy. At the end of the day, if Pepsi doesn't want to be a junk food company, that can't be something it can do overnight. It can't even be something it can do over the course of 5 years. It will probably be something that will take a whole generation, something like 20 or 25 years to effect that transformation. And so what she did was say, look, in the context of my tenure as CEO, it's unlikely that Pepsi will make the transformation from a junk food company to a health food company, but I will set in motion a series of innovations and a series of protocols within the company that will put us on that path. And it will be up to at least two or three successive CEOs to continue that strategy for it to be able to see the kind of fruits that you would require to say Pepsi is a health food company. Now, many people who are concerned about the obesity epidemic in the world might look at that and say, that's just not enough. We need to do more to address the obesity epidemic. And that's absolutely true. We do. But I think this is a very good example of the point. You cannot therefore expect business to do it, because any profit-making business will draw the line at some place, just as Pepsi learned. So yes, we need to solve the obesity epidemic, but that solution is going to have to come from government. And government has looked at things like soda taxes, et cetera. It's going to have to come from civil society. It's going to have to come from media driving consumer choices. It's going to have to come from public personalities like sports people not agreeing to serve as brand ambassadors for Pepsi or other junk food products. That's how this kind of social transformation happens. It doesn't happen by expecting a for-profit company to give up its profit motive. That's not realistic. So when I offer the first two rules for businesses, those are sort of the boundary conditions that I'm trying to specify. Don't ignore the problem altogether. Don't say that there's no obesity pandemic in the world, no obesity epidemic in the world. That would be effectively disingenuous. That would effectively create enormous amount of distrust with your stakeholders. But don't pretend that you as a for-profit company will be able to solve that issue. So that's the first sort of two rules that I lay out there, which is on how business can respond, which again, I'd like to offer as boundary conditions. The next two rules are really saying, okay, well, if you've given me boundary conditions, that might be helpful, but how do I determine where the equilibrium response is? That's what I really want to know. So, okay, well, that's where this second, the third and fourth rules come up. And the third rule is around something I call asymmetric capabilities. And I say that in order to figure out your equilibrium response as a business in the context of managing in the age of outrage, in the context of managing the legitimacy challenge to shareholder capitalism, the thing you really need to be searching for is areas where you have asymmetric capabilities. Now, what do I mean by that? Again, let me give you an example. And the case study I will use here is that of Nestle. I try to use big global companies as case studies because everybody knows the brand Pepsi, everybody knows the brand Nestle. Sometimes I have to use more obscure companies, but in this case, Nestle is also a very well-known company. Now, the case study that involves Nestle, I'll in the interest of time, I'll just abstract it into something very brief. Basically involved a situation where Nestle was on its, Nestle is a market leader in manufacturing instant ramen noodles across the world. These are sort of those instant noodles that you can put in a pot of boiling water and then you make it. And this particular case study focuses on their ramen noodle product in India. And on the package, on the labeling of the ramen noodle packet in India, they have the words "no added MSG." MSG is monosodium glutamate, which is, some people see it as a health risk. And certainly it is a competitive differentiator for a company to say that it's making instant ramen noodles without adding MSG. Now, what Nestle intended to say when it said no added MSG is that it was not artificially adding MSG into the production process of the instant ramen noodles. But if you're fabricating ramen noodles on a commercial scale, then there is what is known as naturally occurring glutamates in the ingredients. So if you do any kind of test for MSG, in Nestle noodles or anyone else's noodles, you will show that it tests positive for MSG. So now it just so happened that someone in the health regulator, the equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in India, the FDA in the United States is what it's called. I'm not sure what the equivalent body in Colombia is, but that regulatory body for food and drugs did a routine test of the Nestle product, the ramen noodle product, for MSG. And lo and behold, it tests positive for MSG. So the regulator calls up the company publicly and says, look, you are basically lying on your product packaging when you say no added MSG. And Nestle says, well, we mean that we didn't add any artificial MSG. And by the way, why are you going after us? Everybody's doing it. Now, as you would imagine, when you're caught out by the regulator to say everybody's doing it is a terrible excuse. That's a way to get into tremendous trouble, not just with your regulator, but also with your customers, because then you're building trust with customers, and you've represented your product as one that has no added MSG. And then when you're called up, you're said, oh yes, but everybody's doing it. Now your customers don't know whether to trust you or not just on this product, but on all the other product claims that you make. So even if everybody's doing it, the idea is that Nestle, as a big multinational company with a big global brand, is seen as having an asymmetric capability to behave more responsibly in this market. And in any other kind of market that it operates. There is the responsibility that comes from having, in the words that I'm choosing to use here, asymmetric capabilities in a particular space. This product is marketed to children. Nestle should know better that parents will buy this product with the intent that children will be using it. And to say that everybody's doing it is not the standard that Nestle wants to hold itself to and its customers want to hold itself to. So if you're trying to be a business responding to the age of outrage, one of the important things is to recognize your capability asymmetries as a way to bound your responsibilities. And I offer actually companies 4 quick questions to help them understand whether they've got asymmetric capabilities in any situation. And if the answer to any one of these 4 questions is yes, then I say you have a responsibility to act. So the questions are really simple. The first is, am I directly responsible for the anger? If the answer is yes, then you should act. Will my inaction directly exacerbate the anger? So I may not be directly responsible for the anger, but if I don't act, people will get angrier because they will see me as having those capabilities. If the answer to that is yes, then I should act again. In acting to alleviate the anger, is that part of the commitment that I've already made to stakeholders? If the answer is yes, you should act. And do I want it to be? And let me give you an example. In the case of Nestle, this is pretty straightforward because the answer to the first question is yes. Am I directly responsible for the anger? Yes. Because, of course, if you said no added MSG and you've added MSG, then you're responsible for the anger. But I'll give you another example, which is that of Johnson & Johnson, which is another big, well-known company. And Johnson & Johnson, back in the 80s, this is a very old case study, was facing a rather unfortunate situation where some unknown terrorist was injecting cyanide into its Tylenol capsules. So they were just randomly picking Tylenol capsules from drugstores and injecting cyanide into the capsules just in random shells. So some person just was unlucky to pick up the one dosage of Tylenol that had been injected, would take it, and of course cyanide kills instantly, so would die. This created a massive terrorist scare. And in fact, people stopped buying Tylenol, and the head of the FBI even told Johnson & Johnson not to act because it's not Johnson & Johnson's fault. Some terrorist was doing it, and the head of the FBI was worried that if Johnson & Johnson pulled the product, if they recalled the Tylenol, then other terrorists would copycat this to other products on shelf because, of course, you can do this not just with Tylenol, you can do this with any drug that's out there in the marketplace. So Johnson & Johnson is not directly responsible for the anger. And their inaction would not directly exacerbate the anger because the FBI, in this case, was telling them not to respond to the anger. So the answer to the second question is also no. But is acting to alleviate the anger part of their implicit contract with shareholders? This is where the story gets really interesting. And actually, there's a great story of the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, a guy called James Burke, who thought, okay, well, the FBI said don't act, so we shouldn't act. But it was still nagging him. And in the middle of this crisis, he wakes up one night with a throbbing headache. And of course, what is the cure for a headache? Tylenol. So he goes to his bathroom closet and opens the door to get some Tylenol. And he finds he himself is hesitating to take his own product because he doesn't know whether his product is the one that has the cyanide in it. And so that's his moment. That's his epiphany as a CEO. He says, well, if I, as the CEO of this company, knowing that my product is fully safe, am hesitating to take this product, imagine how difficult it must be for every one of my customers out there who don't have all the information about the product quality that I do. So he said, it's part of my implicit contract with my stakeholders, in this case, my customers, to deliver a safe product. And so, and to the answer to the fourth question, and I want it to be. And I want to be the kind of company that's seen as going above and beyond. And that was, in some sense, a foundational moment for Johnson & Johnson, which tested its legitimacy with its shareholders, with its stakeholders, with its customers, in the context of saying, what is the contract? What is the implicit contract I want to build with my customers, with my stakeholders more widely? So it comes down to this notion of capability asymmetries. Again, if you think of those boundary conditions, don't ignore the problem, but don't, try to sort of overdo it and become an activist either. These four questions around capability asymmetries help you bound where are the situations where you as a business need to respond to the legitimacy concerns, and where do you say, actually, you know what, I'm a business, I'm here to make money, and I can step back. And this just gives you a framework for thinking about these issues. The fourth question that I put out there is that of what I call legitimate expectations. And what do I mean by legitimate expectations? By legitimate expectations, I mean that a business has really when you act in these situations. So, for instance, when Nestle says, I'm going to create a reputation amongst my customers for being really focused on product quality, or when Johnson & Johnson creates that kind of reputation, makes that kind of statement as a company, what they end up doing is creating a perception or an expectation in the minds of their consumers that might actually go well beyond what the company intends for it to mean. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. And the case study I use here is IKEA. Again, another very well-known brand globally. People know what the IKEA. It's a world's largest furniture company. IKEA. They make reasonably cheap furniture. And IKEA is a global brand. Is very much one of sort of a very sort of progressive company. If you've ever been to an IKEA store, you'll know that it looks like going to Sweden. Going to IKEA looks like going to Sweden. They have Swedish flags everywhere. They sell Swedish meatballs. It has this very Scandi modern chic to the design of the stores. And actually, way back in the 1990s, well before anyone was talking about this, IKEA was one of the first major companies in the world to run a same-sex marriage commercial. Okay, this is in the 1990s, so 30-something years ago, they were running same-sex marriage commercial. So this is a very, very progressive company. At least that's the expectation that they've created in the minds of their customers, of their stakeholders, of their shareholders, that we are a company that stands for liberal, progressive Scandinavian values. But it turns out that in Saudi Arabia, where IKEA had been operating from 1983, they had been airbrushing out the images of all women from their catalogs. So, they're the IKEA furniture catalogs, which you thumb through and you see all these pictures of furniture. And usually there are pictures of people sitting on the furniture, that part of good advertising. And if there's a family, there'll be a father, a mother, 2 children, or something like that. And in the IKEA catalog in Saudi Arabia, it would be the same picture of the father that you would see in, say, Sweden or Germany or America, or wherever it is. The same picture of the 2 children, but the mother would be just airbrushed out as if she didn't exist. And they did this with their catalogs in Saudi Arabia for 20-something years. They never got caught, and so they just assumed it was okay. They'd started doing this, perhaps in the 1980s when they first got in. Now, suddenly, in 2012, this news hits the headlines. Right? Someone in Sweden gets hold of, quite by chance, an IKEA catalog in Saudi Arabia. And this becomes front page news in Sweden. Not just in Sweden, it becomes front page news in Germany, front page news in America, in all IKEA's Western markets where it has this uber progressive image. Now, imagine what a scandal it is. Customers are calling for a boycott of IKEA, etc. This is not a conservative company. This is a company that is going out there and selling products on the image of being a liberal company. If that's the choice it's made, then being called out, then being identified with this kind of hypocrisy becomes especially jarring. So if you decide that you want to play the game of acting on capability asymmetries and you want to build a reputation as a purposeful business, you've got to recognize that every time you do that, you shift the goalpost and you basically move the goalpost probably even further than you wanted it to. When you act responsibly as a company, as a business in a certain situation, your stakeholders will imagine that you mean it, even if you didn't mean it, even if you were being completely cynical and limited about it. Your stakeholders might imagine that you mean it. So the next crisis hits, they will expect even more of you. And you'd be like, whoa, for me, that was a one-time thing. Very often, companies get into a lot of trouble when they find themselves in this situation where they've acted on a particular capability asymmetry, but they haven't thought through how that action will shift legitimate expectations going forward. And in this age of social media, it makes things much, much easier, right? So IKEA had been doing this with the airbrushing of the catalogs for maybe 30 years, but it was in the pre-internet era. And so now these catalogs are so easy to scan and put online, although they're print-only catalogs, they're so easy to scan and put online. And once someone has scanned it, it's so easy to tweet it. It's so easy to post it on Instagram. And suddenly you go from having one catalog that's sitting in one country that's very hard to sort of transport and to get the word out. Suddenly you've got millions of people seeing it because they've tagged IKEA. They've got hashtag IKEA scandal or something like that. So social media makes this even more sort of tricky for companies. So if companies want to play this game of being responsible, which I think is important that they do, they need to be aware that each time they play this game, they shift the goalpost, perhaps further than they intended to. And it's important to recognize that, because simply otherwise they will get caught out on that situation. So that gives us sort of a sense of what the fourth rule is. Again, I said there are boundary conditions. Don't behave like an activist, but don't ignore the problem either. How do you identify then what is an equilibrium response? The notion of capability asymmetries. And if you're thinking about acting on your capability asymmetries, the flip side or the corollary of that is to watch for shifting expectations. Another rule or two rules that I put out because they're corollaries to each other is to try avoid politics, especially the kind of populist politics that are driving the outrage that we see today. I mean, every day we see a new scandal associated with Facebook, and that is very much of a live and ongoing issue. So I'll refrain from talking about Facebook because of that. But you can see how easy it is for big companies to get mired into populist politics. And Facebook is sort of damned if it does, damned if it doesn't. It was criticized for censoring politicians, but it is criticized equivalently for not censoring them enough. So getting involved in politics is a very, very dangerous game for any company. But it's an especially dangerous game for companies, multinational companies operating outside their jurisdiction. And the case study here, again, that I use is one of Walmart, again, because it's a very sort of well-known brand. Most people globally know the brand Walmart. In India. So when Walmart first came into India, they decided that, India had a restriction because of protectionism and tariffs and things like that. They had restrictions on what is called multi-brand retail. So you could have single brand retail shops like Levi's could operate because it's one brand selling jeans. That was fine. Or if you were multi-brand retail, like a grocery shop or a department store, you had to be Indian only. You couldn't be an overseas company. So all multi-brand retail had to be Indian. Single brand retail could be global. And Walmart was, of course, a foreign multi-brand retail operation. So they were coming into India for the first time. And one of the things they wanted to do was to shift the regulations around the restrictions on overseas multi-brand retail operations, because otherwise there's no way for Walmart to operate. So Walmart decided to lobby, like many businesses get involved in lobbying. They got involved in lobbying, and they decided to spend millions of dollars, in their words, to educate Indians on supply chain efficiencies, because they said, well, the reason why you want someone like Walmart as a overseas multi-brand retail operation in the country is because we'll be able to drive supply chain efficiencies. We'll be able to reduce the cost to the consumer. So, for instance, a watermelon that currently costs $2 will cost $1, because Walmart has the kind of buying power that means that we pass on all of those savings from the supply chain to the eventual consumer, and that's why Walmart's been so successful. It drives prices lower. But the problem, of course, is that when you're an overseas company coming into a country and you're spending money on changing the regulatory regime, there are incumbents in that regulatory regime who are going to be threatened. For instance, the domestic multi-brand retail enterprises, who are not going to be happy about the situation. And all they need to do is to find out how you're lobbying, where you're lobbying, and make it into a political issue. So even before Walmart could begin operating, even before it could open a single store, it found itself in a tremendously difficult situation, because it was sort of front page scandal of, trying to shift the rules of the game in a country that wasn't its own home country. And of course, with the legacy of colonialism, when Western countries come into Western companies come into other countries and try to shift the rules of the game, it always ends in scandal. So how do companies then solve this problem of trying to shift the rules of the game, because they might have legitimate purpose in doing so? The best advice is always to work collectively rather than to work as one individual. And work by collectively, I mean work with as many companies as possible, as many sectors as possible, operating through business associations rather than through individual companies. Now, of course, there are plenty of cases where that goes wrong, and I'm no fan of lobbying, as you know from the last talk last week. But there is a legitimate space for some sort of lobbying in the world, and lobbying through business association, where the interests of individual companies can be mitigated, is perhaps more effective in long-run legitimacy than a single company lobbying. The one sort of effective case study example there that I will give you is that of how the global consortium of, I think, about 12 of the largest banks in the world, which effectively control more than half of all the international financial transactions in the world, came together in the wake of 9/11 to build global standards for anti-money laundering. So I've got AML there on the slide. AML is anti-money laundering. So this is 12 of the largest banks in the world coming together to build a collective standard against money laundering, working with intelligence agencies to help them identify in real time what are suspicious transactions that might enable terrorism. So the challenge after 9/11, it became really clear that terrorists were wantonly moving money across borders with little checks and controls, because banks were not citing these suspicious transactions. In many cases, banks didn't even know who the customers were, and they were simply letting the transfers go through. 9/11 changed that. And as a result of that, countries like the United States started putting very, very harsh restrictions on banks around knowing your customer. Now, the banks said, whoa, if you put all of these restrictions on us, you will drive us out of business, because the cost of complying with these restrictions is more than the profit margin that we currently have. The kind of restrictions that the intelligence agencies wanted were basically, they wanted real-time reporting of every international transaction by big banks. That would be prohibitively costly. Well, by any bank, not just big banks. That would be prohibitively costly. So what the banks did was work with the intelligence agencies. They came together as a collaborative, because they said, look, this affects the entire industry. They came together as a collaborative and worked with the intelligence agencies to say, okay, how do we get you the data that you want in real time in a way that keeps the cost manageable? And that was an example, I'd say, of effective collaboration in working to inform the rules of the game. across a sector, across geographies, because of course, and this might be perhaps low-hanging fruit, because no country in the world, with the exception of maybe one or two, wants to be seen as sort of, supporting terrorism. So most countries were aligned with the goal here, which was to cut back on access to terrorist financing. So this was seen as sort of a global public good. And at the end of the day, as much as bank CEOs want to make money, they don't want to have blood on their hands. They don't want to be seen as making money by enabling terrorist financing. So incentives were aligned there as well. And that created effectively the kind of win-win where companies and regulators could work together. There are, of course, very limited situations where that can happen. But one situation where that can happen is very much climate change. And remember earlier, by earlier, I mean last week, so you may not remember, when I spoke to you about sort of alternatives to shareholder capitalism, I said, if we're really serious about issues like climate change, then the only way to address that is to shift consumer preferences. That is to shift the preferences of consumers in a way that allows them to be more sensitive, more price sensitive, or more decision sensitive to polluting products. Now, companies can very much take the leadership role in this space, because as we've seen from the last few years, and also from the drama around COP26 that is happening in Glasgow as we speak, global government action on climate change is very, very unlikely. It's sort of we're very far away from grand global multi-governmental agreements, multilateral agreements on climate change. However, about 200 CEOs of the world's largest companies have already come together very publicly, signing a statement saying that climate change is one of their global priorities. Okay, well, this is an area where they can put their money where their mouth is. The problem with climate change today is that much of carbon accounting, much of the way companies report on ESG, and I presented some data on this in the very first day, where we've seen a surge, almost 4,000% increase in corporate reporting on ESG over the last 20 years. But at the same time, we haven't seen a corresponding increase in, or corresponding decrease in, mitigating CO2 or any kind of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot of talk on climate change by companies, and indeed by governments, not enough actual real action. A lot of the carbon accounting and ESG out there is just what we would call greenwash. It's just a lot of rhetoric. And now this is a bit of a personal plug for my own research, but just last week, my co-author, Bob Kaplan at Harvard Business School, and I published a paper in the Harvard Business Review that offers what we argue is the first rigorous approach to auditable carbon accounting. Now, there's nothing particularly new about our paper in that it draws on 200 years of best practice in financial reporting and auditing, and it simply applies those principles to carbon accounting. I offer this simply as an area where businesses can really take the lead. If you've got 200 CEOs of the Business Roundtable saying climate change is our top priority, well, then my challenge to them is say, okay, well, here's a carbon accounting system that will be minimally costly to adapt, because it runs on the existing financial reporting infrastructure. It runs on the existing software and the existing auditing tracks that you already have in your business. Why don't you embrace this? The end result of a system like this would be the ability to provide on any consumer-facing product information about the total GHG impact of that product. So imagine I bought an iPhone, but as I was looking at it, I would be also considering a Samsung or a Huawei phone, or whatever the equivalents are. And in addition to the price of these phones, I was also able to see reported information on the carbon footprint of these products, so that I could say, okay, an iPhone is $1,000. It's got 50 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. A Samsung is $800, but it's got 70 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. I'm just making up these numbers. I don't know that these are, in fact, the prices or the CO2 equivalents. I'm just saying. So just like when you buy a box of cereal at a grocery store, you get the price of the box of cereal, but you also get its nutrition information. So you can say, well, do I want to buy Cocoa Puffs that are maybe cheaper but have lots of calories in them? Or do I want to buy, some sort of healthy granola that is very expensive but is sort of, calorie friendly and so forth? Sure, low in sugar and things like that. The idea is that there is the ability, there are systems, there is technology out there for businesses to provide robust, reliable data on climate actions to consumers, to be able to use the market process, to be able to use the power of demand and supply curves to drive consumer action on climate change, completely absent or outside of government intervention, completely absent or outside of any kind of government action, whether it's global cooperation on regulation or taxation or anything like that. This is an area where business can lead. And if business is really serious about it, incentives are aligned. Nobody benefits from a world where sea levels rise by 1 meter. That would be a massive catastrophe. Business can be seen as driving a win-win in this situation, especially if you're a company that has a supply chain where you're able to source carbon-friendly products. This becomes a source of competitive differentiation. So why not do it? So these would be sort of limited cases where I would see the arguments for win-wins, where I would say we can rely on business to do the right thing. It's in the issues where we cannot rely, where we cannot see what business is doing, that we cannot rely on them doing the right thing. And that was the focus of my last presentation. The final sort of rule that I have out there, these 7 simple rules for business, is that actions matter. So, it's great that you're acting on climate change. It's great that you're acting on cyanide poisoning. It's great that you're acting on same-sex marriage. It's great that you're acting on MSG, whatever it is, depending on your business. But actions itself don't drive trust. Trust is driven by perceptions. And CEOs or companies often lose the trust battle. So the last few years, I've been working with the big audit firms particularly in this country, in the United Kingdom, on issues associated with their trust. They are supposed to be in the business. Auditing is supposed to be in the business of trust. It is the basis on which capitalism is supposed to function. Because if the whole premise of capitalism is that you invest in companies without knowing the managers of those companies. And the reason that system works is because you've got auditing that will represent the fidelity of your investment. But auditors themselves, perversely, are facing a crisis of trust. And part of that is driven by their own actions that have decreased the perceptions of their trustworthiness. And some of those actions, of course, are things like many of the audit firms are in the business of selling tax advice to companies on how they can lower their taxes by creating offshore entities and so forth. If you're in the business of auditing, being in the business of tax avoidance is terrible. Cross-selling, right? Because effectively it undermines your core product, which is auditing, and it sets you up for a legitimacy challenge in everything you do. Now, I don't expect audit businesses to give up on their highly profitable tax businesses. This goes back to my idea that businesses are really in it to make money rather than, to do the right thing, quote unquote. They will do the right thing so long as it's aligned with making money, but it's very hard to expect businesses to leave money on the table. But the lesson for businesses in this game is that the actions alone are not going to solve the problem. It's the perception of those actions that are going to matter. And oftentimes they lose the trust game. So this brings us back to the question that we raised at the very beginning. Will these 7 simple rules that I've offered, will they solve the crisis in capitalism? I will be the first one to tell you absolutely not. But they can make a positive difference. The impact for business in solving the legitimacy challenge around capitalism is real but limited. That's the key message, that shareholder capitalism is the best system that exists, that we know of for any kind of economic organization anywhere in the world. It has deep flaws. Some of those flaws can be solved by business through win-win propositions, But many of those flaws cannot be solved by business at all. They will require government regulation, and they will require strong civil society to address them because they're not win-win. And it is a deeply dangerous idea to imagine that we should either abandon shareholder capitalism because of those flaws, in part because we don't have anything better than it, but it is equally a dangerous idea to assume that businesses will solve those flaws, because solving those flaws are not win-win propositions. So these are 7 rules to address the crisis of legitimacy in capitalism. They are limited in scope. I'll be the first to admit them, but they're better than nothing. And they suggest that a large part of what we need to do is to rejuvenate governments. They suggest that a large part of what we need to do to address these legitimacy challenges is to rejuvenate community norms and civil society institutions, institutions like media, institutions like universities, institutions like the press, and so forth. In fact, part of the reason why I moved from teaching in a business school to teaching in a school of government is said, well, the real action is in schools of government, because governments are facing these massive legitimacy crises in the world. And one of the things that we need to do is to really get, the right skill set in government to solve the scale of these challenges. That, of course, is a topic for a whole other day. One of the things we're doing here in the Oxford Blavatnik School is building, we have a case center here that identifies case studies of public entrepreneurs, that is, entrepreneurs in the public sector, whether in government or in civil society, that are doing really creative things to improve the trust gap, to drive solutions that address some of these legitimacy challenges that we've been talking about. Each one of these is going to be, small scale solutions, obviously, because the nature of the challenge is such that, a single grand sort of policy proposal isn't going to solve it. But the idea is that from these small scale solutions, we can get insights that we'll be able to leverage through the economy, through society. And perhaps for another day, we can talk about what those innovations in government look like. What are some instances of government innovations that have succeeded, that have been quite impactful? What are innovations that have not, and perhaps we should abandon? But let me, in the interest of time, stop here and turn it over to my friends on the faculty to comment and perhaps moderate the questions. So over to you.
Thank you, Karthik. Professor Mauricio.
Thank you, Professor Ramanna. Thank you very much for your speech. I have learned a lot of things these days in these sessions. Also, thanks, Professor Jorge Iván, for inviting me to comment. I'm going to do some comments in Spanish because I want to be precise. I'll ask a couple of questions later. Bien, pues en primer lugar, muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Las 7 reglas que nos ha planteado el profesor Ramanna, pues son pragmáticas, limitadas, como él lo ha señalado. Tienen el objetivo de ayudarnos a intervenir frente a la indignación que se puede estar presentando y que se está presentando en el mundo. Yo quisiera adoptar una postura un poco distinta, desde un marco conceptual quizás distinto, para comentar primero estas 7 reglas que nos plantea el profesor y luego hacer unos comentarios generales recogiendo los comentarios de las anteriores sesiones. Entonces, lo primero, pues claro, digamos, un lector, cualquier lector interesado en la gestión de negocios, encuentra estas 7 reglas interesantes, ¿no? Porque, pues, ¿quién no estaría de acuerdo con que las empresas no interfieran en política? ¿Quiénes no estarían de acuerdo en que, pues, las empresas no obvien los problemas? Pero yo me pregunto, ¿será posible que las empresas que tienen un gran tamaño y que además han influido de forma determinante en la construcción de normas, en el actuar del Estado simplemente no hagan nada? Y la pregunta es, yo creo que aunque, o mejor, el asunto es, aunque normativamente les digamos que las empresas no deberían interferir en política, pues las empresas lo hacen. Y decir que no deberían confiarse en que su tamaño les lleve cierta ¿no? Es quedarnos sin hacer nada frente a lo que las empresas podrían hacer. Los casos que nos ha presentado el profesor Ramanna, pues son emblemáticos de algunas situaciones que pueden salir mal, pero no deberían generalizarse para señalar que, por ejemplo, las empresas no deberían actuar de manera coordinada para intentar transformar algunas acciones usando las capacidades, los recursos y el tamaño que tienen. Por supuesto, yo entiendo que las empresas pueden desviar sus intereses, pero esto implicaría reconocer también qué cosas han hecho mal las empresas. Digamos, en las conversaciones previas, en las presentaciones previas del profesor Ramanna, me parece que hay un optimismo desbordado sobre la idea de que las empresas han actuado, todas ellas, bien en general. Creo que las empresas tienen ciertas responsabilidades muy grandes en el estado actual de la situación del planeta, en la deriva que el capitalismo ha tomado. Ese capitalismo ha tomado esta deriva no solo porque los estados no hayan actuado bien o los gobiernos, o no solo porque los ciudadanos no tengamos un espíritu cívico. Yo creo que la transformación de la ciudadanía y la captura del Estado ha sido una acción deliberada de las empresas y por ello pensar que simplemente las empresas cambiarán de actuar siguiendo unas reglas como estas que reposan en una idea muy liberal, que reposan muy en la idea de la autonomía racional del individuo ciudadano o consumidor, pues son bastante idealistas, digámoslo así, ¿no? Asimismo, yo creo que la idea de ganar, pese a que es un argumento muy interesante, pues nos pone en tensión. Porque si nosotros señalamos que el capitalismo de accionistas, que es el que ha estado en boga desde los años 70, debe continuar, la maximización del valor para el accionista solo se consigue a costa de disminuir en otros lados los beneficios, ¿no? Es decir, hay que reducir los salarios, hay que invertir menos en protección medioambiental, hay que pagar menos impuestos, hay que trasladarnos a otras jurisdicciones donde exista menos control. Por consiguiente, yo considero que la idea de ganar no reconoce el apetito voraz que la lógica del capitalismo de accionistas ha promovido y que en la gestión se ha materializado en una gestión centrada en las perspectivas de los inversores sin reconocer las necesidades y los intereses de otros grupos. El comentario final que quiero realizar antes de hacerle mis preguntas al profesor Ramanna es el siguiente. La gestión empresarial en los últimos 30 años ha sido guiada por la idea de que hay que maximizar el valor para los accionistas, que se reduce a la expresión repetida en muchas ocasiones en estas sesiones sobre que las empresas están solo para hacer dinero. Yo comparto que en el capitalismo las empresas crean riqueza, pero también tienen que distribuirla y no solo concentrarla. Y creo que la idea de que el capitalismo para accionistas debe permanecer reproduce los procesos de concentración por medio de una gestión empresarial que financiariza la empresa, la pone en función de rendimientos simplemente financieros. Por supuesto, mis comentarios reposan en marcos conceptuales menos liberales que los que tiene el profesor Ramanna, pero creo que resulta importante contrastar sus muy interesantes y rigurosos argumentos con estos elementos. Aunque algunas cifras muestren un incremento en algunos salarios, tenemos otras cifras que muestran un deterioro de la participación del excedente social en el trabajo y una hiperconcentración en el capital. Tenemos cifras que muestran que el cambio tecnológico que se ha introducido y la velocidad de este cambio tienen una afectación sobre el medio ambiente brutal. Tenemos evidencias de que los límites y la resiliencia del planeta para continuar con una idea de que la lógica de acelerar la tasa de ganancia implica destruir el valor previamente creado, pues esas evidencias también están desde otros marcos. Comparto con el profesor Ramanna que el Estado debe revigorarse y que el Estado juega un rol central, pero quizás no baste con que el Estado revigorice su rol y que seamos unos mejores ciudadanos si las empresas también no cambian. Por eso tengo algunas preguntas. Finally, I have some questions for you, Professor Ramanna. And I hope that they will be clear for you. It's widely accepted that we are currently facing environmental, social, and economical crises on a global scale. Do you consider that there is a relationship between the way of managing corporations, that's to say the corporation actions, and this crisis? If your answer is yes, what companies have done wrong? And do you think that the maximization of shareholder value is the most appropriate reference and the main objective for business management at this time and for the future? And if your answer is yes, why? Thank you very much, Professor Ramanna.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. For the question, I'm sure the discussion was outstanding as well. But of course, unfortunately, I don't speak any Spanish, so I have no idea what you said. But I thank you for that as well. But the question is a great one, and as I understood it, you said, is there a relationship between the actions of corporations and the kind of situation we find ourselves in today, which is this crisis in capitalism we're talking about, all of the issues I talked about on the first day. And then the second is, if there is, then what can be done about it effectively? Is that, or how should companies respond to it? Is that the second part?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is the question.
Okay, great. So the answer to the first question is yes, in part. As I said on the second day, in fact, part of the reason why we are in the situation where we are, where we've got sort of rising inequality, and sort of the rich are getting richer and richer, and owners of capital are getting richer and richer, whereas labor is not, is because capitalism has been spectacularly successful. And in fact, if you look at the data from countries like, China and India, and indeed many sort of sub-Saharan African countries, countries in Southeast Asia, capitalism has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. One would argue billions of people out of poverty. So yes, capitalism has been spectacularly successful in generating wealth for owners of capital. Some of that wealth, perhaps not enough, has trickled down to labor. And so on the one hand, you could say business has been tremendously implicated and responsible for it. But I would say that, that's why I said in part, because one reading of the situation is that business has done its part, which is create wealth. The purpose of business is to create wealth in society, and they've done its part. Now, once business does that, It is the role of governments, and it is the role of civil society, by moderating the relationship between business and government, to ensure that there is a fair and equitable distribution of that. That might be through minimum wage rules, that might be through policies around taxation and redistribution, that might be through educational vouchers for better quality education, that might be through access to higher quality healthcare, all of the various things that you would see governments do. Civil society has a role to play here as well, which is to serve as a moderating influence on the political power of business. Because whereas business has been very, very powerful and very effective in its money-making schemes, civil society has done a really poor job of moderating that influence. It's very hard to get media to cover stories about regulatory capture, because those don't make for sort of compelling stories. The decline of religion in public life has meant that the idea that we can have sort of active moral conversations about what is the appropriate role of business CEOs, of business executives, that those sorts of checks on business power have also just sort of been mitigated over time. So as I said in the second day, the answer is yes, business has been implicated in this, but I would say that it's not business's fault. It's the fault of government and civil society. Now, part of the reason government and civil society has failed is because of the political action of business. But all the more reason you don't want to put business in charge of the solution, because business's DNA is about making money, number one, and they do it very, very well, as we've seen over the last 30, 40 years. And number two, when you put business in charge without having anyone watching over them, they will make even more money. And so we will take a bad situation and make it worse if we imagine that business alone will be the solution to this. So the action really is in reimagining government and in reimagining civil society, rather than in reimagining business, because business is done really well. That's the core of my argument on that point. Oh, sorry, Jorge, you have another question in the chat. Sorry, I just saw that. The United Nations has proposed the UN Global Compact to enhance social responsibility amongst enterprises. Do you think that it may have an impact on businesses to change its concern about climate issues? Look, I think it is part of those civil society. All these actions are part of that kind of civil society pressure on business to take this responsibility seriously. Right now, there's a lot of talk from business on climate change. Very few businesses are actually doing real work on climate change. So can we build more accountability into the system? Can we bring more visibility to the actions of business and hold them on this? So for instance, I think it was 2018 that Larry Fink, who's the world's CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest money manager, wrote a letter about profits with purpose and how business needs to have a purpose. And, all of the sort of pundits, they applauded him and say, oh, what a great CEO. But at the end of the day, he has not changed anything about how his own people are compensated. His own money managers are compensated within the firm. So there's a lot of talk about profits with purpose, but he hasn't changed the way asset managers are compensated. They're still compensated on financial returns. So all of these things like the UN Global Compact, actions by university professors like all of us on this call, actions by the media, all of this is important as part of the accountability mechanisms around business in order to drive authentic business action. But I'm very, very skeptical that if you don't have this kind of oversight and authentic and accountability, that business will do the right thing without anyone watching. One example that I often give of business leading social change is in the United States in the case of gay marriage. So if you look at sort of the evolution of norms around gay marriage in the US from 2004 to 2012, it's a remarkable transformation. in just 8 years. In 2004, George Bush ran for president on the platform of a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage. And that was the dominant platform. It was so popular. And the opposing side, John Kerry, was anti-gay marriage, right? So one was saying constitutional amendment against gay marriage, and the other was against gay marriage, but no constitutional amendment. That was the political discourse in 2004. In 2012, gay marriage had become a constitutional right in America. You're like, wait a minute, how did that transformation happen so quickly? Well, it turned out business led that transformation. And there's a really interesting book to be written by some sociologist somewhere about the business transformation of social norms around gay marriage. Now, why did CEOs lead on this when public opinion was so far behind? I would argue for two reasons. One, there's a commercial reason, which is, of course, it became a competitive differentiator and so forth. And on that basis, they were able to hire top tier talent and so forth. If you were a gay friendly company and you offered same-sex marriage benefits and you advocated for same-sex marriage, then you were able to attract top quality talent. But it's also that the social norms are, the kind of cocktail parties that CEOs go to are the kind of cocktail parties where, university professors go, where sort of the elites in society go. And the social norms on CEOs in that moment were very much to act on this. Now, a similar sort of process can work in the context of climate change. If the people who hold CEOs to account in cocktail parties are the people who put pressure on them on things like climate change, we can make real progress. But there needs to be accountability, otherwise, or there needs to be a commercial incentive there, because if you don't have either, it's very hard to see how they will lead on these tricky issues. In a for-profit activity, the cost of green products should be assumed by consumers or by companies that assume them. So I think it's a combination of, do investors pay for it? Do consumers pay for it? Or do companies themselves sort of pay for it? And when companies themselves, you mean, does labor pay for it in the company? Because someone has to pay for it somewhere in a general equilibrium model. I'm skeptical of the idea that investors are going to pay for the problem, right? You look at all these green funds that are out there. How many people, firstly, are willing to put their pension money in green funds? At the end of the day, when people invest in capital markets, they invest for a financial return. And yes, the proportion of investments that are going into green funds has increased, but the returns that these green funds provide are either on par with or below what general funds provide. And their ability to survive in the long run, therefore, I remain suspicious of. And again, like I said, there are companies like BlackRock, et cetera, that very much are in the business of talking about these things, but it's not clear to me that they're actually driving sort of authentic action on climate change. So I'm not sure that capital as a force in society is going to bear the price of climate change, unless, of course, they're taxed to do so, which is another option. Labor, how many CEOs are willing to take a pay cut personally to sell a green product? You say, well, I want to sell a green product at the same price as my competitor, so I'm going to take a pay cut. Which CEO is going to do that? I haven't found one who's going to do that. So I don't think labor is the solution here. That does kind of leave us with consumers. So if we want there to be a solution to climate change that's market-driven, this is outside of the realm of taxation, because of course you can tax companies, you can tax investors, you can tax consumers. So outside of the realm of taxation, if you want a market-driven solution, then my sense is realistically it has to be consumers. And consumers have to be willing to discriminate not just on prices, but on the quality of carbon. Now, it is true that there's been enormous impact or change in consumer behavior on the basis of nutrition labeling. So one of the things that I'm arguing for is let's get robust, auditable carbon labeling on every consumer-facing product. And just like putting calorie information on cereal boxes changed the preferences of consumers, putting carbon information on all consumer-facing products. If I'm looking at the choice of two SUVs, I know what is the CO2 equivalent of SUV 1 and the CO2 equivalent of SUV 2, and I can trade off across prices. Particularly in Europe, consumers are actually fairly fairly carbon sensitive, and are willing to pay slightly higher prices. Of course, there will be some sort of elasticity to their price response, but they're willing to pay slightly higher prices for higher quality products in terms of carbon emissions. And so I think that there is enormous potential for companies to use clean supply chains as a basis for carbon differentiation. In fact, that's why I've written this article in the Harvard Business Review about how to do rigorous supply chain accounting for carbon. I mean, the reason I'm putting so much energy into that is I say regulation is not the solution because it's very hard to get global cooperation on taxes, let alone on carbon taxes. It may be a solution in theory, but it's very hard to see how the geopolitics will work. We can't trust companies to do the right thing when no one is watching. So the next best thing is to build a robust accounting system that allows us to take the information directly to consumers. And if consumers really do care about the planet, then that might be the best way to solve this problem. To get the information in front of them, so that if I happen to know that, in fact, my iPhone was a really sort of, compared to other smartphones out there, a really carbon heavy product, I might make a different choice. That's what I'm hoping will be sort of the key point of leverage here.
Thank you. There is another question there in the chat.
How does this corporate responsibility also involve consumers? Rather, how to get them involved? I think that's sort of very related to the question that I just answered. So, I mean, for me, I think it's about getting data in the hands of consumers. Consumers behave based on the information that's presented before them. Already there is a lot. There's a whole business around green products, and Walmart has a whole line around green products. Whole Foods has a whole line around green products. So there are a lot of Tesla is one of the most valuable companies in the world right now. I think $1 trillion valuation today. It's in the business of selling green SUVs. So there is enormous money to be made in the green economy. The problem with the green economy today is there's a lot of greenwashing. That there's a lot of claims that are made that are effectively unverifiable. And what I see as the first order solution to this problem is to get high quality data in front of consumers on the carbon footprint of the product, of consumer facing products and services, by the way. We should get data on consumer, just like you can get prices on services, you can get data on the carbon footprint of services, and any consumer facing product or service should come not just with a price, but should come with a GHG data point. Just like any food product, you cannot buy any food product now anywhere in either the US or Europe without having nutrition information on it. The same can be true for carbon. And we can drive that transformation within 5 years, because the enterprise resource softwares that are necessary, the ERP systems that are necessary to drive that already exist. The technology already exists. We know how to measure carbon at source. We know how to measure CO2 emissions at source. We know how to measure N2O at source. We know how to measure methane emissions at source. We have the supply chain accounting systems to drive them. So there's no reason why in 5 years, you should not be able to pick up any product or service and have rigorous auditable GHG information on it. I think that is the most powerful lever here, more powerful than taxes even, and certainly one that works within the context of free society. If we want to preserve a free society, we can't rule by fiat. We can't say some products are off limit and some products are on. Ultimately, we want consumers to be able to choose what they want, but get them good data is what I say. How to strengthen civil society to enforce companies with these, social tensions. That's a great question. And, I'm certainly not an expert on that. I focus more on business government relations, and my emphasis is certainly on trying to keep business honest. And if there's one thing that I always get involved in is when companies say, when people say, oh, business will do the right thing. I say, oh, hold on, let me show you all the mountains of evidence. So that's the problem I focus on. There's certainly lots of people focusing on the question of how do we rejuvenate civil society. And I'm certainly no expert, but there are lots of people focusing on the question of how do you reinvent the media in a way that allows media companies to be independent of commercial interests, and at the same time responsive to sort of the legitimate needs of society. The entire media business has been decimated by online information and the sort of the internet revolution. So media is a key force. I think the decline of religion in society probably parallels the growth of a liberal society and a free society, which I happen to see as a good thing. But of course, there are many people who are religious who will see that as less than good thing. But no civilization anywhere in history has survived without having institutions that convene the population around moral issues. And in the past, the church used to do that. The church doesn't have the same standing in society, I think, for all the right reasons. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having moral conversations as a society. No civilization has ever survived without having legitimate moral conversations and having a convening platform for those conversations. So we need something to replace religion and the role of religion in society. Universities are a possibility because universities are places of learning and they are open to ideas in a way that religious institutions are not. So maybe universities are an area where we should be investing more. There's also sort of the role of the arts. We've seen declining funding for arts, certainly in countries like the United States. You can look at sort of what's on national television in countries to get a sense on the on sort of the state of the society, state or health of the society. And the fact that I don't know, Kardashian or whatever is the best. I don't know whether it's the best show in America, but that's the thing that Americans watch, Keeping Up with Kardashians. That makes me very nervous because that suggests that with all of the great science and art in society, that's the thing that people watch. Now, again, look, it's I don't want to be in a society where people tell you what is the right thing to watch and what is the wrong thing to watch. But it does make me nervous that that's the thing that we watch as a society. That said, the other day I came across a great explanation by one of the world's leading quantum physicists on quantum computation in the brain. And one of the things that gave me great hope for humanity, this was a free lecture on YouTube. And one of the things that gave me great hope for humanity was that there were 5 million views of that YouTube video. So that 5 million people had actually watched a lecture on quantum computation in the brain. That gives me great hope that as human beings, we are interested in learning and knowledge, in art, in advancing sort of our collective human endeavor. But the question of how to rejuvenate civil society is a great one. And I think one in which each and every one of us, particularly in universities, have a huge role to play.
All right. Okay. On behalf of our academic community, our administrative team, led by Dean Jorge Armando Rodriguez, on my own name, I'd like to thank you, Professor Karthik Ramanna, for these 3 sessions. Professor of Business, Professor Ramanna is Professor of Business and Public Policy of the Capitalism School of Government at the University of Oxford. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation for joining us in this new version of the Launchling Currie Chair 2021. For those that have not been able to join us the last week, let me remind you that Professor Ramanna is an expert on business government relations, sustainable capitalism, and corporate reporting and auditing. Professor Ramanna has studied how organizations build trust with stakeholders and the role of business in designing sensible and responsible rules of the game. Thanks to his deep research on non-market strategies in Africa, China, the EU, European Union, India, and the US, we have during these days certainly benefited from the different insights across the three talks Professor Ramanna has offered us on sympathical market, the social responsibility of business, capitalism in the age of ultrash. Issues that reflect the social, cultural, and political tensions that our societies are facing today, notably in the relationship between enterprises, governments, and communities. Professor Ramanna, as our dean mentioned on the first day, we hope to have you again among us in person in an early future. I also like to thank Professor Jair Duque, Juan Javier Saavedra, Mauricio Gomez for the comments, Professor Francesco Bulbiciano, who advanced in the organization of this chair, also the communication team of the SIT, and Unimedios, and the members of the technical teams that supported this transmission for their wonderful job. Professor Ramanna, once again, thanks a lot, and we hope to see you here in Colombia.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Jorge, for having me.
Right.
Okay.
Have a good evening. Bye.